Let's see. So, one hot topic in the financial world right now is the PPP loan, the Paycheck Protection Program. We've talked about that a couple of times on the podcast. I wanted to take a look at one of the interesting things that's happened. Is there's an article in CNBC entitled "Ruth's Chris Steakhouse owner says it will repay $20 million in small business loans." And so, what's going on is that the loan was originally set up so that companies who had less than 500 employees could apply, and Ruth's Chris kind of sidestepped that rule by applying using two subsidiaries that each individually had under 500 employees. And so they then were approved, got the 20 million in loans, and then had subsequently decided that it was a bad PR move and that it wasn't the intent. When they saw that the loan ran out of money for other businesses, they realized what impact they were having, and so they're going to go ahead and pay back that money, which is a good intention. And we saw Shake Shack actually do the same thing. But I thought it was interesting because the way the law was written is that when payments happen, it doesn't necessarily generate new loans. So even though they said, okay, oops, we're going to go ahead and give all the money back, it's not a given that that money will then result in new loans made to the businesses who would have gotten it had they not taken the money. And so I guess what I wanted to talk about is kind of whose fault is it when regulation doesn't work? When they set up these kinds of deals and then companies abide by the rules, but the outcome isn't what people kind of generally agree should have happened, then, is it the fault of the regulators or is it the fault of the business who maybe knew they were doing something questionable? And so, yeah, I just want to kind of open that up for discussion.
Yeah, and actually, Brian Crow, friend of the podcast, sent over some numbers. The latest Seeking Alpha article, or I guess bullet points, kind of said that at least 243 million went out of the 349, which doesn't seem like a staggering amount compared to the 349 billion that was pledged. But publicly traded companies, 15 with over 15 of them with over market caps of 100 million. So I thought that was kind of different when it was small business, and I guess the SBA probably should have done a better job of defining what a small business was and who would apply for those or who could apply for those. I think we talked on a prior podcast how venture-backed firms were being considered and how that was kind of loosely put in and not well defined until later. So yeah, I think the onus lies with who the loans are originating with and who's drafting that kind of requirements for the loans. I think the blame solely lies with them. These companies were acting in their, selfish best interest to try and keep afloat during the time. It's not just because they're publicly traded or really large companies that they don't need some kind of payroll protection or some kind of business protection. But I think the way the loan was marketed through the Small Business Administration and being, basically led the public persona that it was for smaller companies. I think that's why you're seeing a lot of this backlash, and probably that lies with who made up those regulations in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. It is the legislatures and the rulemakers who kind of mess this up. And I mean, it's very similar to what we see with a lot of tax rules, right? So if you're asking the large picture conceptual question, is it ethical or is it good for businesses to optimize their use of the rules to take the best advantage of government programs and to minimize their tax liabilities when we're talking taxes? As an ex tax advisor, I do broader stuff now, but as somebody who did a lot of corporate tax advising, I wholeheartedly believe that it's perfectly reasonable and fine for companies to maximize their use of the rules and the regulations, because the problem in our system with the republic that we live in is that when you try to say that the intent of a rule was a singular thing, you can't do that, because any kind of rule like this was created by a Congress made up of a lot of different people with a lot of different intents. And then it was signed off by a president who may have had a slightly different intent. And so the reality then is that you have to then kind of look at, well, what is the result? What are the rules of the game here? And it sounds cynical to call it a game, but to some extent it is, right? And what are the rules that we're playing by? And are we fairly and in good faith trying to follow those rules? And I think that would be true in the case of PPP, just like it is true in the case of following and adhering to corporate tax laws. And in this particular case, I mean, you can see kind of the chain of events that went wrong here in terms of, you can see how the politics kind of was a backlash to how they actually just wrote the rules wrong for what now they're saying they intended, right? It's the politics that's circling back and saying, oh, wait a minute, maybe that's not what we intended. But the PPP started out with the idea of, hey, we need to get money out to small businesses so that they can maintain jobs. And that was the first kind of thrust of the idea. And then from there, what they realized, which actually is, you can disagree with this, but it's also somewhat logical, is that, hey, one of the industries that's hardest hit by this whole thing is restaurants and hospitality. And so when we define a small business as being 500 or less, maybe we need to make an exception for restaurants and hospitality if they've got lots of different restaurant locations and we want to keep those people employed, right? So just because a one company might have a lot of different locations, maybe we want to let them have access to this money as well. That was decided in the law. It wasn't like somebody just came up with this idea after the fact. They decided to do that in the law. They made that part of the law, that it was not only for just what you might strictly think of as a small business with less than 500 employees. They actually threw this exception in there and said, hey, if your company actually has more than 500 employees, we'll still let you get this if you have less employees on a by location basis. What's interesting about the article that we looked at is it's hard to tell exactly what the technical issue there was for Ruth Chris, or if there even was a technical issue, because you would imagine that Ruth Chris could avail themselves of the by location rules, right? But then the article talks about the legal subsidiaries, which seem like that would be that wouldn't really be an issue one way or the other, because if you get into the depths of the rules here, there were what they called affiliate rules, which said that, if you get outside, forget the special rules for restaurant hospitality. If you have two companies that are affiliates of each other, each may have less than 500 employees on their own, but combined they would have more than 500 employees. You just flat out didn't qualify. And that was clear in the rules because they would be affiliated with each other. So I don't know if that's the issue with Ruth Chris, if they're saying, hey, they did something they weren't really qualified for and they got away with it and now they're putting it back, or if they really did qualify themselves based on the by location rule.
Yeah, I think my belief or my understanding of the article was that they truly did qualify, but they just didn't intend for it to run out of money so quick, and they didn't intend for probably such a negative PR move to have come out of their decision to take the loan. And so
here's the iffy part on the did you qualify, right? Because the rules were confusing. When we talk about putting the onus on the rule makers, they were confusing in terms of the eligibility requirements. And basically what they said is, hey, it's not up to the bank to determine whether you're eligible or not. It's up to the borrower to determine whether they're eligible and to certify that they're eligible, right? So it's interesting on this topic that this article is talking about. People may have seen that there were press conferences with Trump and Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, citing these very cases. And Mnuchin said something very interesting. The words that came out of Mnuchin's mouth, he said, we're not sure that people understood what they were certifying, or whether they actually knew the rules well enough to properly certify that they were eligible. So, that statement led me to believe that the Treasury, Mnuchin and the Treasury, were thinking that perhaps they were going to claim that some of these companies actually violated the rules, but just didn't understand that they violated the rules. Now, I don't know exactly what the technicality of that would be, but it was an interesting statement that he made in that press conference when he said that. And so, and I think there's two pieces to it. Like there's are you a small business, right? That was one thing that primarily seems like was a lot of the anger that you heard over this was companies that weren't small businesses. But there's a secondary kind of concern, and Trump kind of spoke to it. And it was in the same conference or press conference where Mnuchin made that statement. Trump railed against Harvard because they took the PPP. And basically Trump's line of thinking on this was not about how big Harvard was. That's not the statements he was making. What he was saying is they clearly had a lot of money because of their endowments. So they just didn't need it. That was his rationale. So the thing about this is that what they asked businesses to certify to, this is the confusing part, right? Because they didn't ask businesses to certify that their business had already been damaged due to coronavirus, and therefore or that they were going to imminently run out of money. There wasn't a requirement that you certify that. The requirement was that you certify that there was uncertainties in your business due to the coronavirus. Well, almost everybody can certify that. Even if you have lots of money in the bank, you might have uncertainties as to what's going to happen with your business due to the coronavirus. None of us know where this is going yet, or what it's going to ultimately do to the economy or anything like that. But it's interesting because it was in that context that Mnuchin said, we're not sure people understood what they were certifying. So I don't know how much of it is about the politics of how big the organization is, or about the politics of whether you really need it or not. Because what we actually know is that even if you were a small business, there's some small businesses that are well capitalized that may not have technically needed it, but took the PPP as well. And so I think there's a lot of people biting their fingernails right now wondering, oh, well, if there's going to be political backlash like this about size, is there going to be some kind of auditing or political backlash on the fact that some of us took this, even though we had a bunch of cash in the bank already anyway?
And since we have Ty riled up already, I might mention that they specifically carved out that you didn't need anything certified by an accountant. Also, so
yes,
can't blame us accountants for this one. You know, we'll take full blame for all the tax issues, but like this one, we can't. You know, they didn't ask us to certify it. So.
Well, you know, we're editorial here, so we don't have to deal with facts. And so I'll say I've heard a rumor. I've heard
People say, right?
Yeah, I've heard people say that there may be something going on with the SBA, maybe engaging third parties or potentially auditors to start looking at companies that took the money and seeing whether they should have qualified or not, kind of thing.
Well, while we're doing rumors, I thought I'd also just bring up the other rumor that I've heard on this topic, which is that I've heard a lot of backlash saying that banks intentionally shuffled the deck, so to speak, so that big companies would get the loans quicker than smaller companies because they were their bigger clients and that sort of a thing. And so I just think that's another interesting variable in it, is whether or not you believe that happened, because clearly that was the intent of the law at any point. And I don't know if that's the case, but it's just kind of an interesting factor to consider when you have a fixed amount of money to distribute, you know.
Well, it wasn't, you know, and that wasn't necessarily part of the law, but I don't think it was necessarily ruled out in the law either. And I think there is a rationale from a banking perspective on this point, because, and I heard as people were applying, I heard a few different banks and banking associations make this case that there's some rules that came in with banks and it had to do with dealing with money laundering and terrorism and stuff like that. But there were rules that had come in over the last decade which require that banks get a lot of information from their clients, essentially, in order to go through a financial transaction. And so what the banks were basically saying up front, they were saying this weeks ago, before the PPP ran out and before even applications were open. They were openly saying this point that, hey, we're probably going to serve our customers with existing relationships first, because they're going to be first in line, because we've already checked that box. We've already gotten over that particular regulatory requirement of knowing our client with them, so we can get to them faster than somebody that we haven't worked with. And so that was just a reality on the ground, that if you had a banking relationship with a bank that works with the SBA, you were already you were just going to be ahead of the game. That's just how it was.
I think there's kind of like two subpoints there, though. I think that makes perfect sense. Like if you're going to do a loan, and if you've already created an online profile and done all your customer work, then it's going to be easier for that bank to loan you money. And I think that is legitimate. Like that's just the facts of trying to do this. But I think that the secondary question of, are larger institutions favored, is maybe that's a different question that is similar. But I think maybe a lot of people would say, yeah, it's fine to favor people who have an online banking, but not because of the fact that they are gigantic as a customer or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's the business aspect, though. If you thinking about that point that you just made in the context of some of the big deals that we were looking at in the article, it's like, well, if you can make one $20 million loan versus lots of little loans, and you're going to get essentially the same commission as a bank, what are you going to do?
Yeah, totally.
Right.
Specified. So it should have been written, if they didn't want that to, it's then obvious that they're going to give the money to the big companies. But then if they didn't want that, should have been written in some way,
Yeah. The incentive structures had to be set up in a way to inspire that. Yeah.
Maybe I get you guys' take on this, because I think, setting the funding side apart, I've heard from clients that have got the PPP delivered. Now they're trying to track the eligible costs and trying to have, I guess, strategies around that, and then input from the bank. And so they've been asking the bank if they're, tell us what the eligible, do you have a listing of how you would like to see the eligible expenses, what the SBA is requiring for those expenses to be, forgiven, for the loan to be forgiven. And the bank's answer, at least the bank that I saw answer the client, said, they haven't issued those yet, and, they're not available. So I think the big challenge is, here these people have this money and what it's directed towards, and they have a pretty good idea of what's allowed to be expended, or what would be forgivable portion of it, but tracking and then what form they want to see and what the requirements are that they're going to need to present when they go for forgiveness is unknown at this point.
There's definitely some unknowns in the technicalities of that, but not surprising, what most banks are saying, drum roll please, is open a separate bank account, of course, and put all your PPP money in there, and then you can use that to better manage your expenses. As far as I know, there's no actual requirement for that in the law itself, but that's the guidance that most banks have been giving out.
So we got given that story by banks as well in the companies that I've worked with, and we're adhering to it because we feel like it's worthwhile to do, and it's easy to do when you're working with the money that has been loaned to you. It's an easy concession to make. But yeah, I do think it's interesting, because I did see an article talking about how it was fine if you had routed the expenses through a credit card and then used the funds from the loan to pay the credit card, that could be fine. So I do think there's a lot of what you're saying, banks just trying to get you to use their stuff.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, that was the answer. That was the answer I got from, or the client got from the bank. Well, we don't have that. But the easiest way to track it would be to open up a new bank account. So it's funny.
I got an article we can discuss that's maybe a little more, abstract, I guess. I've got an article from, Spectrum Local News, saying that a flood of business bankruptcies is likely in the coming months. We all kind of knew that as this pandemic started and people are changing and staying at home, that businesses were going to have trouble trying to adapt. There's some specific things in the article talking about how money took too long to get to the right people, and that it was a stopgap at best because it's not a replacement for the revenue that they would get. And so there was also an interesting point where it said that even a lot of the places that are hopeful that they will reopen feel that once they reopen, they can't return to normal operation because of social distancing. So they said restaurants can't keep capacity even when things are working. The article looked at how many bankruptcies happened after 2008, and it said that there was 160K bankruptcies from filings from 2008 to 2010, and then tried to, talk about whether or not that was going to be a realistic, whether or not that would play out the same way. And the other thing is that there has been, since they know that there's going to be so many bankruptcies, they've added in some regulation such that attorney fees are streamlined in bankruptcy proceedings in the coming months, so that, I guess in the coming years, to try to make sure that, businesses who are already in a bad spot aren't getting raked over the coals. And then the other interesting point that it made that I thought was good to talk about is that it said one of the effects would be that the stigma of bankruptcy would go away, that people look at it as a bad thing now, and that you view, not that you're viewed as a failure, but that the feeling that you get when you're filing is that you feel as a failure, but that because this is happening to everyone, that stigma goes away, which will then normalize bankruptcy. And so I guess I wanted to get your guys' take on whether or not you felt that the stigma of bankruptcy was previously effective, or whether or not you think that's really going to change in the next year or so.
I think you can kind of make, if you want to talk about stigma, I kind of think of in like the 1970s, if you had a DUI or knew somebody that had a DUI in the 1970s, man, they really had a drinking problem. But now, if you talk to people, because they've lowered the alcohol percentage that you can get a DUI with and really strongly enforce that kind of enforcement, you'd be hard pressed, I think, to find somebody that didn't at least know somebody that had a DUI. And so when you talk about a driving under the influence, the stigma is no longer there for like I guess the social repercussions of having a DUI are no longer there, because everybody probably knows somebody that's had a DUI because the requirements to meet that threshold are so low. Now, I'm not saying we should do away with DUI laws. I think the blood alcohol, I don't think anybody should be driving intoxicated, period. But what I do think, I'm talking simply about the stigma of it. So I think there's a case study there to be made that if, a lot of businesses start going through this, and it would be interesting to look back at the historical data and how the stigma around companies, like say construction companies that went bankrupt and restarted, if that affected during the 2008, the Great Recession of 2008. I'm wondering if those, and I'm mentioning construction because housing was hit so bad, if there's a stigma or a lack thereof among the construction trade that could be kind of amalgamous to this. But I think the point remains that if there's a large swath of the United States, or, basically, it's who you know, if there's a large swath of people that you know, or there's somebody in your immediate group that has went through a bankruptcy and you feel it's of no fault of their own, then probably, or multiple people in that situation, then yeah, I would agree that probably the stigma behind a bankruptcy would lose its steam, And so, I don't know, time will tell, but it's an interesting, I think, proposition where, that may not hold as much weight as it once did.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from a business standpoint, I think that there's been in my view, I was thinking about this the other day, that I feel like there's an unfortunate difference between going through personal bankruptcy versus running a business that goes through bankruptcy. Because I think that what I've seen, or my observation, is that if you're an entrepreneur and you have run a business or even multiple businesses that have gone through bankruptcy, it actually isn't that much of a stigma. If anything, usually in the process of doing that, you've made more connections, you've gained more experience, and often you become kind of in the industry that you're in. And a lot of these entrepreneurs and leaders have good opportunities after the company or the business itself goes bankrupt. And that's interesting when you compare that to if you were a solopreneur where the business was you personally and it was wrapped up with your personal finances. I think the system is more rigged against you when you personally then go through bankruptcy. I mean, it messes with your credit. I think there may be more social stigma. I guess the social stigma piece of it, I'm a little bit ambivalent to. I maybe because I don't have much of a social life outside of my family and the people that I work with. So for me, there's not much of a difference between business and social stigma. Like, I don't care if the neighbor down the street knows I had a bankruptcy. It doesn't make any difference to me, right? That's just not the world I live in where that would matter. But I suppose there's other people who's like, oh, Uncle Fred went through bankruptcy and that makes them the black sheep of the family somehow. Maybe that's an issue in some people's worlds. That's just not an issue for me. I don't like, if somebody in my family happened to have gone through bankruptcy, I wouldn't think much one way or the other if I even knew that. And I don't worry that they would think about me in that way. one way or the other. So for me, social stigma is not even an issue. It's really just, what's the business effect of this? Does this mean that I don't have access to capital because I've gone through bankruptcy? Does it mean that I couldn't get hired for the kind of job that I might want because I've been through bankruptcy? Those are the questions that come to my mind. But what I've said is that if you're operating at a high level, it seems like running a company into the ground, and which, let me be clear, I'm talking like pre-COVID, because there's a lot of businesses a lot of people who took a lot of big risks unrelated to coronavirus, that what I said, run their companies into the ground, may have gone through bankruptcy, or ultimately near bankruptcy, had liquidity crises in their companies, and then they just go on and work for or lead other companies after that. That's very, very common, because the thing is that it's accepted and known in business that your leaders have to be able to they have to have the ability to take risks. And one thing about somebody who's run a company that goes through bankruptcy, you can say about them is they were willing to take the risk, right? And so, yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of my gut feeling about it, is that it doesn't necessarily sink you from a business perspective that you were operating a business that ultimately had a liquidity crisis or went through bankruptcy.
Yeah, totally. Because I think that, I mean, for one, we've had all these famous people who have famously had a bunch of bankruptcies. I think Walt Disney went bankrupt, I don't remember if it was 3 or 4 or 7 times or whatever it was, but you had that. And then I think also you view a business bankruptcy, or at least I view it oftentimes, as a product of circumstance. A lot of times a business is wrapped up in an idea, and then that idea fails for a reason that isn't a failure of the owner or of the management of the business. It's just an issue of that product became irrelevant and that business wasn't set up to pivot or whatever. And so I agree that there's definitely a difference in personal bankruptcy versus corporate bankruptcy. And yeah, I just think that we're going to see a large amount of companies restructuring, and that it will become normalized to an extent, and that, yeah, like you said, there already wasn't that much of a corporate stigma, but there will be even less now, because people view it as this special event. It was part of the challenge we all faced together. And so, yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Unfortunate for everyone who's going through that, obviously, but good to know that it's not viewed in a negative light, because we're all facing, struggles right now.
Yeah, I mean, in business, the story matters, right? And I think to what you're saying, what Charlie's saying is, COVID-19 gives you a ready written story. So it makes it kind of gives you the template to move on.
Well, I think maybe we should rebrand bankruptcy and just call it what it is: debt extinguishment. Yeah, I went through a phase of debt extinguishment, and maybe because we're accountants, we look at it differently, where there isn't a stigma for us around somebody that went through bankruptcy, because all they did was execute a debt extinguishment that they couldn't pay for. So I think, having a clear idea of what it is, and maybe, we can help with the stigma out there. I think we should take a stand on this podcast and kind of rebrand bankruptcy as debt extinguishment. I think
definitely COVID Section 11, we can call it. And then
COVID debt extinguishment,
Yeah.
Reliquidization. All right, I got one last article here, and this is actually, I took this one out for my boy Ty, because it's a deep cut into some taxes. We won't get too far in the details here, but the title of the article is from Bloomberg. It's by Brandon. I'm not going to attempt to say his name. We'll link the article in the description. But anyway, what the title of the article is: New York's out-of-state taxpayer money is suddenly up for grabs. And so the kind of catchline is, the work from home loophole could cost nearly $700 million a month. And the biggest winners in this are Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Win big after going out after what would normally be taxed by New York City or the state of New York. So the whole context around this is New York, much like California, has very aggressive tax laws and wants to claim as many income tax amounts as they can. So if you live outside of the state of New York, but you work inside New York, your money gets taxed by New York, and they're very aggressive about, going after that kind of money. The thing is, though, the tax law kind of has a provision in it, and it's kind of an unknown one, but it says that if you work out of state and you work remotely, you're still, they use the word nexus. The nexus of the business is still in New York. You must pay unless the remote work or the out-of-state work is required as part of the job or due to requirements or out of necessity is the word that they use. And so as of right now, the states are kind of playing nice, and they're allowing New York business that has a worker that's supposed to report to New York for work but is now working remotely. They're allowing that to be still taxed by New York. But then the issue that the article makes is post-pandemic, when they're losing a bunch of this money due to this, those states that might have a shortfall in tax revenue could go to this law, hire lawyers, and possibly win the tax that's due to New York because of the section 132.18a or whatever it is for the New York tax law. So I kind of wanted to get your idea from a tax perspective, Ty, and from Charlie too, whether this kind of makes sense, or do you think that we're going to see like an outbreak of kind of not to use the word outbreak too much, but we're going to see a rash of kind of these court cases deciding and kind of codifying state laws?
Well, and I think the nuance in the discussion, I mean, the way you talked about it, I think is right on, is that it's pitting the states against each other. And the nuance there to be clear about is that, and I don't know if there's any arbitrage between the rates of New Jersey and New York, for example, but I imagine that there's probably not much, in the sense that New Jersey has state taxes, New York has state taxes. And if you're a worker, if you're getting taxed by New Jersey, I don't know that you have a preference. Like if you live in New Jersey, but your company is in New York, you pay tax to one of them. So from the worker's perspective, from the employee's perspective, they're like, I got to pay tax to some state. I may not really care which one unless there's a sizable difference in the amount that I would owe to a particular state, right? And so what this comes down to then is, well, if all these workers are staying at home and they normally would have paid tax to the state of New York because that's where their offices were, and they just keep doing that because that's their normal way of filing their tax returns, and they're not paying attention to this, right? So you can totally see how this would happen. Is like if you're a worker and you live in Connecticut or New Jersey or wherever, but you normally have your office in New York and you've been paying tax to New York for the last few years, and then this year you go to file your tax return, you're probably not thinking, oh, I'm going to switch and not pay tax to New York. Now I'm going to pay tax to New Jersey where I live. That's probably not at the top of your mind, and that's not something that you're thinking about doing. And like I said earlier, you may not even care because there may not be much of an actual cash flow difference for you as the worker, right? But who cares? Well, just as you said, AJ, it's the states that care, right? This is where New Jersey or Connecticut might come into this and be like, hey, all of you people who live here and have been working from your houses in our state, you need to file properly and not pay New York so that you can pay us, right? It's all about, assuming there's only one pie and the states have to divide it. We can't double tax and have the worker paying the same tax to New York and New Jersey. Assuming that can't happen, yeah, it's just how are we going to divide this? And so, yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see how that unfolds, whether those states do anything proactive. I think that's why the article was calling it kind of a tax grab, right? Are those states going to do anything proactive to take advantage of that situation and try to get that tax?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the kind of situation that they're referring to. And yes, to clarify, it was talking about states going after, that tax money related to the people that's working in that state. And so I thought it was a very interesting thing, and something that I don't think I had thought about it as an accountant, even though I'm not, tax-based in my previous experience, but something that as an individual, I wouldn't think of,
Yeah.
I wouldn't think of when I'm filing a tax. So interesting.
Well, and here's the other kind of interesting angle on it that I was thinking about is like, if you think about what those taxes are supposed to pay, it's supposed to be for all of the things which happen in that state. And so as people who used to commute into New York decide to then stay in New Jersey, the idea that New Jersey would then get that revenue, which New York otherwise would have, and then that's viewed as a not a crime, but that's viewed as a problem in the context of the article. But it's like, if you really step back for a second and you're not involved in either one of those states, aren't we just kind of admitting that costs which New Jersey or New York once bore are now going to be bore by another state, because all of the cost associated with that tax, all the police or whatever needed to be done with that tax money is now going to happen in that other state. And so it's a reallocation. It's not so much that in my view of it, it's not that one state is pilfering from another. It's that the services that used to happen in a work state are now being migrated to a home state, and that happens to be New Jersey. And so I don't even view it as a problem, as long as everyone is able to comply and work within the framework. But yeah, that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. If you're asking about the tax policy itself, I would agree. I'd agree with Charlie that it seems reasonable that if people are not actually commuting to New York, that there's no reason for them to be paying tax to New York, and that presumably means that they're using more services in their home state, and so paying more tax in their home state seems like it would make sense on those grounds.
Let's see, I've got one more article we can talk about. It's not too much to talk about, but let's see. So in NBC, there was an article entitled "Twitter Employees Can Work from Home Forever." And so what it's looking at is just everybody staying from home, basically as a result of this coronavirus. And so they're just deciding to kind of run with it. And a lot of other businesses are kind of following suit. Said that Google has told vast majorities that they're going to work from home until 2021. And so, I guess it's kind of the generic thing. It's hard to find a news article this time of the year without finding the topic of work from home. But yeah, everybody's getting used to, embracing their new future. And so I wonder how much we're going to see a change from even small to mid-sized companies in having people work from home from now on. Have you guys had a lot of discussions about having this prolonged with other clients by any chance?
Well, Charlie, I, for one, when I saw this article, was shocked that people from Twitter and Google were able to even work remotely. I mean, the type of services that they offer, I would have had no idea that they would be able to deliver that kind of thing remotely. I'm joking here, but my point is like, of course, Twitter and Google are going to keep working remotely. Like the reduction in the price of a brick and mortar, of course you are. But my question, and when I was thinking about this article, went more to those businesses that can be done in person or, remotely. And I hate to go back to it, but accounting firms, right? We know that probably, 80 to 90% of what you do in an accounting firm, traditional or untraditional, as our firm is, you can do remotely. And so the question is then, if you're working remotely like that all the time and with more remote work, when you're in an office, you're spending 40 to 60 hours a week with people, and it feels very much like family. And we talked about this earlier in the show, where you get to a point where it is almost like you're probably spending more time with them than you are with your family. And then once you've been there a while, nepotism or, entitlement sinks in. And you're talking about working around an employee that's been there and been a producer, but isn't working as good, or they've always been here, they're a good soul, let's keep them around. And with this, although, it does feel with video, it feels a little more connected, but if you're working remotely and all of the employees are for this, are you commoditizing what you're doing? Does this make this less kind of, does this kind of desensitize that connection that you get when you're in an office or side by side with somebody for 40 to 60 hours a week? Does the remote work commoditize what you do? And then if they can find it elsewhere, if you're just a person behind a screen doing stuff, can they commoditize it out, I guess? And are we going to see service providers or things that can be done through Google and stuff kind of go the way of what manufacturing was, where they can outsource it to somebody somewhere else that can do it less expensive in a commoditized kind of way? And so I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I would suggest that if you're working in an environment like this, to try and start skewing yourself to having those skills and attributes that can't be commoditized away, like the connection of being able to explain
financial statements to non-financial people, or be able to have the skill set to be able to bring some more value other than just the commodity side of the business. But I don't know. Maybe I'm off base here.
100%. And I think when you say commoditized, I think what you're saying or what you mean is that there are certain competitive advantages that businesses have had in the past, and we've taken advantage of that as well. One of those being geographical proximity, right? So, we've certainly taken advantage of Portland-based businesses wanting to work with Portland-based professionals, and that's created a competitive advantage to us. It's meant that even though, in Portland, our fees are higher than perhaps if you hired somebody with a similar skill set in, I don't know, Kansas or Missouri or something like that, right? And so the fact that a client could work with us in person, face to face, we could have lunch with them, we could meet them for coffee, we could be in their office, that we created a competitive barrier with that, right? And so I think that's what you mean, is that we're losing that advantage potentially, that as companies and people are now used to working this way, like we're having this podcast or this show, but also people work this way through Zoom, then it starts to erode at that advantage of being the hometown business, right? Of being there. And so definitely, we talked earlier about making pivots. That's something that's definitely been on my mind about our business is, well, what does that mean about the pivot? How do I capitalize? How do I both deal with the fact that maybe I don't have that competitive advantage anymore, or it's not as important anymore? And how do I also take advantage of the fact that, well, that means other people in other locations don't have that. So maybe I can be competing in other places as well that maybe are more expensive than our particular location for cost of living and things like that. So I don't know if it's necessarily a bad thing that we're losing that competitive advantage, because when you break down what that competitive advantage is, I think I'm on the page of, I do romanticize the fact that I can have lunch with somebody, that I can have coffee with them. But when you start breaking it, when you really start unpacking it in more detail, I don't know if the other elements of it are really all that romantic, in the sense of, we like to have somebody that we can look at them and make a first impression based on how they look and how they dressed and what their body language was. And now maybe that's a little bit harder, that when we work with people in this fashion, we don't do that as much as we did before. Is that a bad thing? Maybe not. Maybe the fact that we are actually going to be more evaluating each other on our work product and on the actual skills that we deliver, and on just the true utility of what we do, as opposed to how entertaining we are over the lunch hour. Maybe that's not a bad thing. So, and that's a pivot, right? It's like, well, whether I liked that you could get an advantage by presenting well over coffee or lunch, whether I liked it or not, it was a truth. And so we learned to play that game. But if that's no longer our truth, then maybe we start to pivot away from that. And I'm not sure that is a bad thing or a good thing. I don't have a good read yet whether I feel that that's good or bad. It is.
I think it all comes down to just realizing that this is happening to everyone else too. So while it's changing for us, it's also changing for everybody else. And so it really just becomes a question of how well you pivot, really, I guess, how well you react to the fact that things have changed and take advantage of what's easier to do now versus what's harder to do now. And so, yeah, I mean, that's easier said than done, but it seems like that's going to be the ultimate test, is how well people pivot.
Yeah, and I think you'll really see like a consolidation of probably talent and like resources here, where you'll see like we've talked about before on this podcast, the pandemic or the crisis is the great accelerator of 2020. And so I think you're going to see a speed, or like a speed more towards what was eventually going to happen anyway, because it's not like video chat and moving away from more in-person meetings and everything was far out on the time horizon there. I just think it's going to happen a lot quicker than it was before. And I think when I'm talking about commoditization, I'm also talking about when you're talking about company culture, how much that changes when you're not, I guess it's anybody's guess, but when you're shoulder to shoulder with somebody in an office, if that camaraderie is different than conversing on a screen or in a video chat, and whether that matters, I think that's all yet to be seen. And yeah. And the kind of, I guess, collaboration that happens in a team, can that happen over video chat the same way it happens in person? I think those are questions, like, especially if you're in a creative space, that are going to be really, really difficult to answer, and only time will tell. I think if you're good, that shines through everything. But I think there's going to be a learning curve here, especially for creative types, to be able to collaborate and to be able to jive with team members via Zoom or however this is going to work, versus in-person shut-in meetings where you're pitching ideas,
And it's also on the receiving end too. Like maybe you're okay with changing to this new way of doing things and you feel like you've got Zoom down and all the different things down, but the people that you work with, maybe not even your teammates, but your boss or whoever else maybe doesn't, take to it as quickly as you do. And so even though you feel confident in it, they maybe aren't ready for that transition. So it's that give and take that's going to be different in every pair of, service provider and service receiver. But yeah, like you said, only time will tell. And, I guess we're all going to find out the hard way. Right. All right, everybody. That's our show for the week. Thanks for watching and for listening. Please like and subscribe. And come back again next week for more business articles and what's going on in the world. Thank you.